Welcome, everybody, back to Neutrality Studies. My name is Pascal Lota. I'm an associate professor at Kyoto University, and today I'm joined again by my friend and colleague, Ian Proud, a former UK diplomat and now a great analyst, publishing the Substack, The Peacemonger. I highly recommend you all going there and subscribing to it. He publishes regularly. Ian also regularly publishes regularly on YouTube on various channels. And Ian, I'm sorry, your own YouTube channel. Where do people find you there?
I've just started. It's called the Peacemonger as well, but you can find it at Ian Proud, the Peacemonger. So yeah, hope to see people there.
And the opposite of peacemongering is unfortunately what we have to talk about, because the warmongers are getting ready to, or in my view, they're getting ready to attack Iran. They've been building up this armada in front of Iran for a while, and they've talked up the armada for a while, but now they're adding additional components of the fleet, and we are seeing on Twitter X reports about flight logs of the United States doing significant airlifts into the region. We've just witnessed in Geneva the discussions. I don't think there were real negotiations, but at least discussions between the Americans, Witkoff and Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of Mr. Trump, with the Iranians, while also doing the same with the Ukrainians, and the Russians. But we'll talk about this. Ian, how do you make sense out of what is currently being built up?
Well, I think Trump is clearly trying to put pressure on the Iranian regime to come to some sort of deal on nuclear disarmament. Of course, I mean, Trump is also the president who, in his first term, ditched the JCPOA, which was a good framework for Iran's nuclear program, or which actually the European nations were kind of fully signed up to, and which is actually bringing Iran in from the cold. Rouhani, if you remember at the time, he kind of spoke at Davos. Everybody was kind of courting Iran. There's a real kind of positive mood at that time. And then Trump came along and completely kind of ditched that. He's now back to kind of warmongering with Iran. He obviously had the strikes against their nuclear facilities kind of last year. This is just about pressuring them for a deal, shortly on the heels of an attempt to actually provoke regime change within Iran itself in an operation that appears to have been sponsored by the CIA and Mossad. And so there are two aspects to this that, as far as I can see. One, that the timing of it, the military bit and the intelligence bit are kind of totally disaligned. So the military bit may be coming into this a bit too late anyway. But in any case, despite the kind of massive flotilla that the Americans have deployed to the Gulf, this isn't really large enough to mount a kind of full-scale military overthrow of Iran in any case. If we take our minds back to the first Gulf War in 1991, the US had 4 carrier strike groups kind of in the region. Actually, Colin Powell said he would have preferred if they'd had 5. They had a 6-month kind of build-up of troops, over 500,000, I believe it was, at the time for that, operation. Those same military factors just don't apply in this case. I mean, obviously, it's kind of a formidable arsenal, but it's not nearly enough to kind of mount a credible military challenge beyond airstrikes, and things like that. So this appears to be purely a pressure ploy, but what it appears to be doing, in fact, is hardening the position of the Iranian government, and also kind of giving them more support in the developing world, including, of course, from Russia and China. So I don't think I don't think the gunboat diplomacy, will succeed. But the fact that the Oman government has been sort of brokering talks in Geneva at their embassy between the two sides is helpful. It seems unlikely that that will change much, as Trump seems to change his position on a fairly regular basis in any case.
These are good points, and the German analyst and former spy Reinhold Rupp also made the point. Like the forces of the Americans in the Gulf have previously been much stronger than they're now, and Iran has been much weaker. However, we're still seeing this tremendous buildup going on, and the one of the kind of analysis that I read and that does make sense to me is that it's not just in the hands of the Americans. The Israelis too might start strikes, and if they do, then it will just necessarily take in the the Americans in one way or another. Do you share that assessment that it's not just in the hands of Washington whether or not this war is going to start?
No, it clearly isn't, and the Israelis clearly want to kind of provoke some sort of action against Iran for their own domestic, reasons, of course. But Israel is not a sort of a major military power. It is, a very well armed military power, as you know, given its horrific actions in Gaza, over the past kind of couple of years. That is clear, but it's not a credible kind of a large enough or indeed proximate military power to offer anything more than a threat in the skies above Iran. But even then, we know from all the kind of open source intelligence reporting that actually its kind of brief war, if it's called a war, last year with Iran considerably depleted Israel's weapon stocks in terms of aerial interceptors, and that sort of thing. So, yeah, of course, Israel would like to kind of do this with the Americans too. But even so, this still doesn't amount in its scale to a credible enough force to mount any sort of ground attack on Iran. And in any case, there doesn't really seem to be the support for that anywhere in the developing world, including in the Gulf states themselves.
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video. Right, but what can we make out of also this scenario, which is highly unusual, that two chief negotiators at the same time on the same day negotiate two kind of wars, although of course the what's going on with Iran at this point is a very very hard conflict, but it's not yet this kind of kinetic war. Although if you look at the things from the Iranian perspective, what happened to them in January and cost thousands of lives was already this type of hybrid warfare, actually, but it's at least not the missiles flying yet. And at the same time, you've got the Americans also negotiating with the Russians. I just can't help it, but it seems to me as if though there's almost something like kind of a tag going on. One war, let's end that one, and maybe we could maybe go into the other one. It's just weird that this is being mixed together right now.
It does, and if you read the U.S. national security strategy that was published, fairly recently, that is a mishmash of a document that looks like it's been written by committee. Look, I mean, Iran isn't the U.S.'s biggest foreign policy priority. It may well be for Israel, but it certainly isn't for the U.S. There's no kind of core U.S. strategic interest in regime change in Iran, even though regime change is a kind of hard habit for them to break, going back over many decades, right? Of course, I mean, China is a big adversary, now, and the NSS makes it clear that that's where they kind of want to pivot to. I mean, it seems to me quite foolhardy to kind of provoke further. I mean, this appears to be an attempt at regime change, really, because on the basis that they don't offer a credible kind of ground military threat to Iran with the resources at their disposal, this can only be pressure with a view to fomenting further domestic unrest within Iran itself, and nothing more than that. I mean, let's see whether it works. Hopefully it doesn't. Hopefully they can reach some deal in which they can back away from this massively disruptive kind of conflict, which would only, as we saw with the Ukraine war, have devastating effects for Iran itself. I fear, as it relates to the negotiations on ending the Russia-Ukraine war. I mean, that is something where actually I think that the Americans do appear to want to end that, and it may be that they want to end it because they want to start wars elsewhere, whatever. But they do appear to kind of want to end that war, and the Europeans don't. And I think that's the big problem we're butting up against, right now, that the Americans are kind of brokering these really difficult, really kind of complex talks on the basis that, up until Trump coming to power, there'd been absolutely no dialogue at all between Western nations and Russia. So, with the Russians themselves, they're starting from a very low base in terms of building trust, in the negotiations. But the negotiations are happening and they're sort of edging forward. I hope they deliver results soon. So I see those talks as a fundamentally positive sign, although I think there are massive obstacles in the way to actually delivering a peace in Ukraine because of European, but also because of resistance in Kiev, with Zelensky at the top.
Why do you think that it is that these talks are organized in the way that they are? Like, Steve Witkoff is not a trained diplomat. He's a businessman and a friend of Mr. Trump. Jared Kushner is his son-in-law, a very young person. I think he's probably 38, 39 or something like that. And he's one of the top team. The Russians are obviously going along with it. The Russian even agreed to fly to Geneva, and not they wouldn't even fly over Eastern Europe, but they went down south and flew over Italy to make just to be sure, which the Swiss apparently also had to broker to make sure that their airspace would be open to them. But they agreed to it. They agreed to come to Geneva. Although they could have said, like, no, if you want to negotiate, we'll do it either again in Abu Dhabi or somewhere else, maybe Istanbul. I mean, that was kind of the obvious choice, but they did that for the Americans because the Americans said they needed to be there because they need the Iranians in there as well. It's just a bizarre kind of setting.
It is a bizarre sequencing of events. I mean, the Geneva talks happened sort of hot on the heels of the Munich Security Conference, obviously. So sort of there's that proximity issue in terms of the US negotiators. In terms of Kushner and Witkoff's experience as diplomats, no, they're not diplomats, but all the so-called diplomats have actually repudiated diplomacy over the past 12 years since the Ukraine crisis started. So if they don't have experience, well, okay, that's certainly, an issue, but they have been able to get the Russians to engage. And I think that has to be seen as a positive sign. Witkoff has been given, quite frankly, if somebody who isn't a diplomat has no real status, or he's been given a title now, access to President Putin, on various visits to Moscow, is a sign that the Russians take this process seriously, whatever his background, CV might say. So I don't really see that's necessarily, a problem from the Russian side, or indeed, well, I think it might be more of a problem from the Ukrainian side than actually from the Russian side. And the people who complain about this tend to be people in the mainstream media. People who complain about Witkoff's lack of experience tend to be people in the mainstream Western media who are the same ones who think the war should continue. So I slightly discount their concerns as it relates to kind of the Russia-Ukraine negotiations. If they can deliver something over the line, then that will be a massive achievement in ending this truly dreadful war. They are less independent and impartial when it comes to brokering issues as it relates to Iran, given Kushner in particular is very, very close links with Israel and the vested interests that exist there, including in some of the kind of outlandish plans for turning, Gaza into Las Vegas on the Mediterranean when this terrible kind of, terrible starvation and collective punishment of the Palestinian people there has finally been brought to its close. I mean, they say it's closed, but um, atrocities still seem to go on anyway. So I think they're much less impartial when it comes to negotiating with Iran. I think they have much less credibility, and rightly so. But who is going to step in and broker? I mean, this is actually ironically an area where the Europeans should be stepping up more, to kind of broker as they did over the JCPOA, when Europe actually played a leading role in sort of delivering the JCPOA at the time when they had a credible kind of foreign policy as it relates to Iran. But sadly, the Europeans, given their desire to kind of keep the war in Ukraine going, and this is where the two issues kind of intersect, they've just essentially kind of green lighted whatever the Americans want to do in Iran, it seems to me.
Yeah, it's important to remember that the JCPOA was essentially also like done under and with the help of the Europeans, with the help of the Chinese and the Russians. I mean, it was a fantastic kind of achievement in order to balance all sides' needs, and it was the fruit of a bygone era where that was aspired to. So two things connected to that: the demand that Iran basically destroy its long-range missile capability, right? And only keep missiles that cannot hit Israel, while Israel obviously is allowed not only to have nuclear weapons, but long-range missiles too, and so on and so forth. Is that, in your view, an approach at making any kind of agreement impossible? Because it's just absolutely obvious that this is something no Iranian can ever say yes to under the current leadership, right? And even from a purely security strategy and deterrence thinking, which the West is very accustomed to, nobody can expect that Iran would actually say yes to that. Secondly, about the Europeans, when we look at the speech that Marco Rubio gave in Munich, and basically praised empire, said we need to reestablish empire and we need to do it together. We Americans love you, and just comment and be with us in this empire building, new empire building moment. Do you think that he said that explicitly in order to make it clear that, guys, never ever think about not going along with what we are doing in Iran and stay online, just the way that German Chancellor did back during the 12th-day war when he called it the dirty work?
Yeah, the Americans' position on Europe is deeply confused. On one hand, the Americans want Europe to become, less centralized. They want to kind of hand power back to nation states. And yet they talk about Europe as a civilizational entity as if it's a single thing, when of course it isn't. It's made up of, well, the EU, at least 27 different sovereign nations with very, very different historical, cultural, linguistic, religious backgrounds, and so on. There's one thing. There's also kind of, where does Russia fit into this? In civilizational terms, if they want to decentralize power back to the nation states, where does Russia fit within that family of nations? In essentially, what is a European or Eurasian, but very European kind of nation? How do you include kind of Russia within that mix as well? And I think they're kind of, even though it isn't made explicit in the national security strategy, I think part of the reason that Trump is engaging so heavily with the Russians is that they want to normalize relationships between Russia and the rest of Europe. And I think the big strategic reason for that is ultimately they see Europe as an additional counterweight to China over the longer term. And this goes back to the age-old, nut of actually kind of getting the Russians on side to kind of compete with China. I mean, I think that's frankly the big game, at play here. But in terms of as a colonial power, I don't really see the Americans want any nation or group of nations to kind of contest its hegemony as the leading sort of global power, even though, of course, China is now a peer competitor. In that regard, I think they have a very kind of patriarchal view of Europe, where they see kind of Europe as being their servants in this kind of big empire endeavor where we all club together and ultimately take on the big beast, which is kind of China. And I think that's what this is really all about. And the Europeans are going along with it. They say we can't live without the US. I mean, you heard Merz say that, you heard Keir Starmer say that, you heard Ursula von der Leyen say that in their speeches. We can't live without the US. So they seem to be willing accomplices in this. But what they haven't done is actually start to address the massive issues that they have with Russia, where they don't want any normalization at all with Russia, where they don't obviously want the war to end, because that could unleash even bigger pressures within Europe itself as Ukraine kind of pushes to join, that club. So the European position is also, I'm afraid, deeply confused. And the Chinese are sitting back watching this as a single sovereign state and probably sort of chuckling to themselves at the complete mess that is being wrought, in the so-called transatlantic alliance.
I've heard several interpretations on this recently. One of the ones that strikes a chord with me is people who say, like, look, at the end of the day, the war in Ukraine, between basically a NATO proxy war with Russia, serves the European establishment, the EU elites, very well. I mean, it's the very enemy you need in order to unify the continent. Basically, I mean, look at us. We're talking about the Europeans. We don't talk very much anymore about the Germans, the French, the Italians, maybe sometimes the German and the French, because we know they're sitting at the helm of the whole thing. But not much about the others. Yes, in particular instances, but we start really perceiving the Europeans as one thing. And if you look at the sanctions regime of the EU, if you look at all of the competences that the EU actually just wrestle out of the hands of the member states, I mean, it might very well be that we are actually in a moment of power consolidation and sovereignty consolidation under the larger EU umbrella, something that might not be reversed even if the war ends, and it's something that the EU elites might be interested in keeping going because it serves their purposes so well. And the militarization, right? Any sovereign state needs a good army, and this is the moment. I mean, being in Europe right now, the kind of militarization talk that I hear even in Switzerland is astonishing. That we need more military, we need more capacity in order to integrate and defend together. It's like it's a real drive. It has momentum. How do you see that?
I see it as a very, very kind of mixed picture. I think on the one hand, the Americans are talking about reversing that trend in terms of handing power back to a nation. And if you look at nation states themselves, you see increasing pressure not to be governed by Brussels. You already see that in Central Europe, but you see a growth of that in Germany, in particular with the AfD. Yeah, the long-running kind of development of that in France, which is the most likely nation to leave the EU next, if any nation does leave the EU. And of course, in Britain, where we chose to kind of leave the European Union project to have our own independence. Now, I was against that at the time, but now I kind of start to understand why it may have made sense because of the creeping centralization, of powers. Reform is surging in the polls. We could, in the third election running, go from one majority party to another, in the UK in 2029. And there's a very real prospect of Reform possibly winning and becoming the government of the UK, which would completely change the complexion of our relationship, with Europe. Now, as to your point, yes, of course, any kind of any autocratic, if you want to call it that, leader needs an enemy to kind of justify the militarization wars and so on. You see that consistently throughout history. In the Second World War is largely driven by feelings of humiliation about how the First World War ended, that Hitler built upon to build his Nazi kind of narrative. For example, you see it in Southeast Asia a lot. It's a subject that I know quite a lot about, particularly in places like Indonesia, at the end of Sukarno's reign and that sort of thing. So this is kind of a classic tactic. But I'm not sure in this case it's going to work, because actually you're dealing with a grouping of sovereign nations that increasingly, or at least their citizens, want actually, their governments to actually serve their needs, not to serve some big supranational needs, which are increasingly dominated by having wars, which actually affect their day-to-day standard of living through the cost of living, through feelings of insecurity, through feelings of anxiety that could be another war forced upon them that they didn't choose. So I think the von der Leyens, the Callas's are swimming against that tide, and I think that tide is going in one direction at the moment, and that's towards individual sovereign nations actually deciding upon their own affairs in Europe, and that's how I see it. So yes, I get the theory that actually Euro elites may see this as in their interests, but I think if they step back from the picture, I think they might notice that the political sands are sort of changing, significantly in Europe right now, and there's very little they can do to stop that. And increasing centralization of powers may only accelerate that trend.
Right. In this regard, it's also quite strange that the Europeans, the most creative ideas the Europeans come up with at the moment, or not the Europeans, but let's call them the EU-crats, right? The EU bureaucratic establishment. The most creative things they come up with is basically solutions that, in my view, will necessarily lead to the destruction of their project. I mean, the idea of giving, what did they call it? Like integrating Ukraine first into the EU and letting them like tick off the boxes of the checklist later. What was that? They gave it a bizarre name, like advanced access to the EU or advanced membership or something like this. Basically, okay, they become an EU member now, and then later they have to fulfill all of the points about fighting corruption and whatnot and so on. Which obviously, if they did that, if they actually included Ukraine and then gave it a seat at the table, the thing would immediately become a major stumbling block on any kind of future decision making, right? Because they didn't still function on largely on the principle of unanimity and so on. And Ukraine would immediately outweigh like a huge say in how the EU itself works. I cannot see how this is beneficial to the project. But how do you see that?
Well, the bigger question is whether Europe can afford to expand, and the short answer to that is that it can't. I mean, its budgetary envelope is now fixed through to 2034. There is no subsidy money to go around to Ukraine if it joins. And I think and actually, you've got this whole list of countries queuing up that are far better prepared than Ukraine to join. Montenegro, I think, is the most advanced. Serbia, is doing quite well. Albania, and so on. All these countries, and Turkey, which has been in the deep freeze, possibly because it's a Muslim nation. I mean, that's just my view. I don't think the Germans would ever really want Turkey to join the EU. But that's an aside. I mean, can the EU afford to bring in all these nations and give them the same subsidies and benefits as everybody else? I mean, the short answer to that is no. And the challenge with the Ukraine is that will be by far the costliest project they want to accelerate first, because of the size of Ukraine's agricultural land, which would take up, if it joined the EU, 25% of all agricultural land, in the European Union, because of the massive size of its kind of infrastructure challenge, which has been destroyed and devastated by 4 years of war that the Europeans, have provoked and wanted to continue, which would take up a lot of cohesion funding, infrastructure kind of funding from the EU subsidies, because of the massive levels of poverty in Ukraine, again caused by the bankruptcy, which has been aided and abetted by the European, elites, which means that they'll get higher subsidies in any way per capita than others because of the income level per capita of their population. Europe just can't afford to do this. I mean, it cannot afford, to do this. It doesn't have the budget. In any case, its budget is tied up until 2034. And so what is going to be offered to Ukraine is going to be some sort of, well, you can have our flag and you can come to our meetings. I mean, Zelensky seems to go to all the meetings anyway, so what's going to be different about that? And not much else. And I think ordinary Ukrainians will say, well, is this what we fought for 4 years for? Just to have a EU flag, over our building and not actually have any money to help us rebuild at a time when the Europeans want them to keep an army of 800,000 people, which they also can't afford. And any EU money that goes into Ukraine will be paying for an army, but not paying for schools, hospitals, roads, power stations to be rebuilt and that sort of thing. It's a completely crazy idea that can only have been thought up in the sort of the corridors of Brussels, which seem to be completely insulated from the real world outside. I'm afraid to say it's a total disaster.
I mean, why would they even pitch that? I don't understand the point of pitching this as a serious idea. I understand why Donald Trump would pitch the idea of, incorporating Greenland into the US. I get that. That serves actually a diplomatic power political purpose of seriously, either trying to achieve it for real, or at least, um, the flock of hens, make them flutter around and feel like very, very insecure, and then go back and reassure them, the good cop bad cop kind of game. I see how that serves a purpose. I don't see how that stupid idea serves any purpose. It's like, other than embarrassing the EU elites, because it's to everybody else it's so obvious that this is, for so many reasons, such a dumb idea, but they're still pitching it.
Well, the Americans just want to get the Ukraine war albatross off their back. And for them, they're not really thinking about the policy consequences of this. They say, yeah, why can't they just join like it's some sort of fast track queue at JFK, for example. Yeah, they can just join. But none of the consequences, the economic and political consequences, matter to them at all. They're not going to have to pay. They're not going to have to deal with the disruption and the chaos. But they want a way out of the Ukraine war. And so trying to shove Ukraine into the EU before it's ready seems to be, to make sense from them thousands of miles from actually where the real issues are decided. And I think again, the bigger question is actually, how can we create a situation where Europe doesn't feel that it needs to continually expand? Because another way to look at this is actually, how do you distinguish the EU from NATO these days?
Right.
They both have exactly the same goal. They both want to defeat Russia, politically, militarily. They want to kind of break the regime. Kaja Kallas talks about breaking Russia up into smaller states. Ukraine and the EU, NATO and the EU are basically the same thing right now. So while Putin has said that he's happy for Ukraine to join the EU, there has to be a bigger discussion about how can you actually have and foster sort of better mutual coexistence between Russia, the EU, Ukraine, other countries in Europe that are not inside of the EU, but want to join in some sort of bigger collective, not in some supranational body, but some sort of format that allows all countries, in the region to kind of coexist, to have economic cooperation, to open up social cultural links, and that sort of thing. So, if you and the problem is really that if you rush Ukraine in before you've had that discussion, then actually what you risk doing is just pressing the pause button on a much bigger general war with Russia between Europe and Russia. Because you'll be admitting Ukraine, which is essentially antagonistic, towards Russia, wants the EU to maintain a fundamentally hostile posture towards Russia. It becomes like the Balts and Poland on steroids, wanting the EU to have a fundamentally, antagonistic and aggressive policy to Russia. So, can you imagine a Ukrainian version of Kaja Kallas as the EU High Representative for Foreign Policy and Security? Just think about what that would be like, and that
Yeah.
might. So without this bigger question of how can you reset economic, social, and cultural relations, including with Russia and all the other countries that kind of see themselves within this bigger Europe writ large, not the EU, but Europe and Eurasia writ large, then actually not really getting to the root cause of how to bring real peace, to the continent.
No, but there unfortunately is a good number of people who don't want that. I mean, we know the neocon game. We know, I mean, Rubio spells it all out, right? It's about, the game is about spheres of interest, and it's about colonial empire building. And these people, they want to use violence and war as a tool of great power politics, right? And statecraft. These sick people, especially the neocons in the United States, these sick people, they think of this as the chessboard, as Jeffrey Sachs keeps reminding us. And to them, basically, integrating Ukraine into the European Union and thereby Europeanizing the war is actually kind of a logical next step. Okay, and then while at the same time disengaging from it, from the perspective of the Americans, because they now have to focus on Iran or whatever it is, and dumping it on the Europeans so they can continue that fight. The Americans then fight with Iran and engage China, first start engaging China through that one, because China made it very clear that they're highly opposed to this, and then go into the third theater in the Pacific. I mean, I can these people unfortunately see it, some of them think in those stupid warmongering terms.
Yeah, they undoubtedly do. But I go back to the point I made earlier that actually the US policy is fundamentally confused. It's
Right.
confused as it relates to Europe. It's confused as it relates to Russia. On one hand, the US seems to want to have some big economic reset with Russia's part, partly for economic reasons, of course, in terms of access to natural resources and so on, joint projects, but partly to kind of build up their relationship with Russia as a counterpoint to China, partly to kind of discuss strategic nuclear deterrent and sort of disarmament and that sort of thing. But also on the flip side, that they want to compete with Russia in the Arctic. So therefore they need to take over Greenland. They need to kind of militarize the Arctic as counterpoint to Russia. So the American position is deeply, deeply confused.
Yeah, but this is where people point out, and even the Russians have been saying, like the Americans said for the last 1 year, that the Trump administration, they want better relations with Russia and a working relationship. But the reality was the opposite. They put more sanctions, they put more pressure, they more attacks started. So maybe just a speech act, just good old lies. Whereas the underlying strategy, as Brian Berletti keeps pointing out, never changes. It's just the rhetoric that's different.
Yeah, you may well be right. You may well be right. But I do think that actually kind of Trump has is kind of he's hemmed in, by the Beltway blob to a certain extent. I think there's a part of him that just he sees people like Putin and Xi as his sort of statespeople, that they're powerful leaders. I don't really kind of see that the Americans want to take on Russia, even though they kind of that they want to kind of keep the Europeans on side. It is a very confused position. But I think actually the sanctions, you go back to 2017 and the implementation of the CASA Sanction Act, against Russia, that was actually against, Trump's desire, and he actually wrote an addendum to the law saying why he disagreed with it, but he was hemmed in by, the US and had to do so anyway. So I guess this comes back to, the very confused nature of US foreign policy, comes back to the very kind of toxic nature of US politics itself, and how, there are just so many people in DC who want to kind of take on the world, who think America's the greatest, USA, and all that sort of malarkey. And yeah, maybe Trump, is part of that too. But there's no shortage of your kind of Lindsey Grahams, your Joe Wilsons, and all these kind of people who basically see the enemy without. They're the modern day McCarthyists who, if they see any small country, even talking to China, for example, they have to be labeled as communists and people who are anti-transatlanticism, and that sort of thing. So I don't think it's fundamentally about Trump. I think it's fundamentally in the nature of the US political system itself. And that, really is a good reason for the Europeans to cut themselves loose from the US and deal with their own dysfunctional politics, themselves, and in the process kind of find some sort of way to live in an accommodation, with Russia over the long term. But this is just such a complete chaotic mess, right now. And so many people are to blame, Ursula von der Leyen, the Eurocrats, the Western leaders who can see their power eroding, Zelensky, who sits atop a corrupt regime in Kiev, Trump, who kind of supports Israel, to the exclusion of all rational logic, and wants to kind of fight, with Iran. And the one nation sitting quietly and just watching all this happen, of course, is China. Who see their power continue to grow on the world stage at a time when the developing world is kind of gravitating towards them, as they see, the decay really in the US and in the EU itself.
Are they sitting quiet though? We now hear about joint exercises, Iran, Russia, and China, and we now see that apparently the Russians are exporting more oil to China. Alexander Mercuris interprets this as maybe the Chinese starting to stockpile more oil in preparation of maybe a closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which apparently the Iranians, it's obvious that that's what they would do if a full-scale war actually did break out. And I talked to Stas Krapivnik and said, like, look, the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians, they're cooperating, but they're not an alliance the way that the NATO is an alliance. They are not in that game of like deep integration building. He then said, like, oh, but NATO is not a real alliance. NATO is a power tool and basically a way for the United States to shepherd its vassals. Whereas what China, Russia, and Iran are doing is proper alliance, like of equals who then cooperate on various levels, but as equals and balance also amongst themselves. Do you see it like that as well, or how are you interpreting this trilateral coordination that's going on?
Well, I sort of echo this sentiment about NATO, but I also think NATO is a massive kind of cash cow for US defense firms. Because all these countries, I mean, why would Montenegro want to join NATO? I mean, nobody in NATO is going to fight for Montenegro. I mean, not that anybody's threatening Montenegro, but do you know what I mean? I mean, they're just not going to do it. They haven't even fought for Ukraine, and that's been a real tragedy of that. So I think it is a massive cash cow. When it comes to China, I mean, I think countries are basically hedging. Russia is certainly hedging with China. Russia is as worried about China on its kind of eastern border as it is about NATO on its western border, and let's be completely clear about that. It makes sense for the Russians to really align, with China in terms of their economic interests, selling oil and gas. But let's be under no illusion that actually they worry about China as a big threat to their very underpopulated, Far East as well. So they're hedging. The Iranians are kind of probably more closely aligned with China, uh, you know, uh, than Russia is. But everybody is hedging. I think that's and Southeast Asian nations are definitely hedging. You look at Thailand, which has been a traditional ally of the US. They have a big Thai Chinese community. They're hedging. Singapore, all these nations are hedging. The only outliers are kind of countries like Japan, which is fully on board with the Americans in taking on China. So I think as it relates to China, everybody's hedging. There. I don't think, even though people talk the language of equal alliances, I don't think that's really the truth of it in terms of the political factors at play. Certainly as it relates to Russia, although Russia undoubtedly does have a good relationship with China, they also see the game there about weakening US control over global financial architecture and agenda the Chinese share. So where interests align and overlap, then they work together. And right now, it makes sense for Russia to engage with China, but that doesn't mean they're closed to the engagement with Europe or with the US if they can get their act together, although there's no sign of them being able to do so anytime soon.
Right, that does make sense. I would only add that also the Japanese are hedging, but they hedge internally. For them, the whole talk of indigenous capabilities is actually, at least to a very good part of the establishment, is real in the sense, in case we have to go it alone, we have to be able to do so, which is not a hedging with somebody, but basically on your own. However, Ian, that was very interesting. Thank you for a very wide-ranging kind of assessment of the situation. Again, people who want to follow you, they should find the Peacemonger on Substack and the Peacemonger Ian Proud on YouTube. Is there any other place people should go?
Yeah, I'm on X, also the Peacemonger. So I am the Peacemonger, although my YouTube channel is at Ian Proud, but it's all headed the Peacemonger as well. So that is my title. I mean, it's a kind of it's a cross it's a burden that I carry. But there's so many warmongers in the world that God bless people like you, Pascal, and others who can promote the cause of peace everywhere, because quite frankly, we really need it right now.
We do. So I love the name, and it's exactly what we should do. Everybody join Ian Proud in peacemongering around as far and wide as you can. Ian Proud, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks so much, Pascal.